There are moments in life, moments that stay with you, carved deep into memory like names etched on stone. I remember the autumn of 1944, not because of the battles or the shifting lines on a map, but because of a girl named Camilla. She wasn't a soldier. She held no rank, but in the heart of occupied France she made a choice, one so brave, so selfless, that it changed the way I understood the quiet strength of those left behind. I had met many heroes during those long, dark years. Some wore medals, some carried rifles, but Camilla, she carried her family. With the world collapsing around her, she stepped forward, not onto a battlefield, but into a role no less dangerous. Her sacrifice didn't echo through gunfire, yet it spoke louder than any cannon. It was a decision born from love, forged in hardship, and hidden behind the eyes of a young woman who dared to carry hope when hope was all but gone. This is not just a story of war, it's a story of resilience, of a girl who gave everything, not for glory, not for pride, but for those she loved. And though many never knew her name, I never forgot her face. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The wedding took place under a grey, windswept sky in a makeshift military chapel not far from the Allied encampment in Normandy. The pews were rows of weathered crates, the altar no more than a wooden table draped in a tattered flag. But to the men gathered there, soldiers hardened by weeks of rain and resistance, it felt like sacred ground. They stood quietly, their uniforms stained with mud and memory, witnessing something rare in the middle of all that chaos, a moment of quiet dignity. Winston Churchill was there, not as a politician, not even as Prime Minister, but as a man deeply moved by the lives unfolding under his command. He stood near the entrance, his coat damp from the coastal wind, his hat pressed firmly against his chest. Few knew how long he had known Alfred Spencer, the aging commander with the iron spine and the quiet soul. They had met during the grim days at Dunkirk. Back then, Alfred had carried wounded men across the beach until his legs gave out. Now, years later, he stood at the altar, not as a soldier, but as a man asking for a companion in the loneliest chapter of his life. The guests whispered as Camilla appeared at the edge of the clearing, dressed in a modest white gown stitched together from donated linen and parachute silk. Her brother Jules walked beside her, proudly wearing the armband of a civilian volunteer. His jaw was set, his eyes determined. He was only 16, but in that moment he looked older, like a boy forced to grow up too soon. Churchill leaned slightly toward the officer beside him and spoke in a quiet, reverent tone. "It takes greater courage to love in times like these than to march into the fire." Camilla took each step slowly, her hands trembling, her heart pounding louder than the wind. Yet when she finally reached Alfred, she looked into his eyes, eyes that had seen too much and carried it all in silence, and whispered the word that changed everything: "I do." Alfred didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. His expression carried the weight of every man who had lost something in the war. There was grief in his eyes, yes, but also something else, hope, the kind of hope that doesn't shout but waits, that survives. The chaplain's voice cracked as he read the vows, barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. The soldiers watched, some with smiles, others with tears they dared not shed. For a few minutes, they weren't warriors. They were simply men reminded of what they were fighting for, the right to begin again. Churchill didn't take his eyes off the couple. He had witnessed hundreds of speeches, thousands of salutes. But nothing moved him like that quiet promise exchanged between two people who had every reason to give up, and chose not to. As the ceremony ended, there was no applause, just silence. And then, one by one, the The soldiers removed their helmets and lowered their heads, not out of duty, but out of respect. It was not the wedding of a general's daughter, nor a nobleman's heir. It was the union of sacrifice and resolve. And to those who understood, it was a moment far greater than victory. Churchill turned, away slowly, his face lined with thought. He knew that one day stories would be told of that afternoon, not because it changed the course of the war, but because it reminded everyone what made the war worth surviving. After the quiet ceremony faded into memory, Camilla was taken by military transport to a place few had ever seen, a grand, crumbling estate tucked between the trees of Calvados. It was Alfred's ancestral home, once filled with laughter, now hollowed by silence. The war had stripped it of its former grace, turning it into a rest post for weary Allied officers. Yet the shadows inside were older than any battle outside. Camilla stepped through the heavy doors with caution. The corridors smelled of damp wood and forgotten time. Dust clung to the tall windows. Portraits of past generations looked down with distant eyes, as if waiting to judge the stranger who had just become part of their story. Waiting at the top of the staircase was Maria Spencer, Alfred's granddaughter. She was young, strikingly beautiful, and clearly untouched by the warmth of recent celebration. Maria had once been married to a Canadian officer who had never returned from the raid on Dieppe. Since then, something inside her had hardened. Her grief had sharpened into something colder. "I suppose I must call you Aunt Camilla now," Maria said, her voice wrapped in sarcasm and sorrow. There was no welcome in her eyes, only distance. To Maria, Camilla wasn't a bride. She was an invader, a foreign name, stitched into a family that was still unraveling. The air in the mansion grew heavier with each passing hour. Even the staff moved quietly, as if afraid to disturb the tension settling into the walls. Winston Churchill, ever observant and aware of the subtle fractures in the human spirit, was informed of the discomfort growing within the house. He didn't act publicly, but he never ignored trouble, especially when it involved those under his protection. Without fanfare, he sent Sergeant Felipe Darcy to the estate, a Canadian soldier who had seen the worst at Ortona and survived with wounds deeper than the skin. Felipe now served in a support role far from the front. Churchill trusted him, not because of rank, but because Felipe understood pain, and more importantly, he understood people. Darcy arrived with a limp and a notebook tucked under his arm. He wore no medals, just the quiet demeanor of a man who had learned to listen before speaking. Officially, he was there to assist with operations at the estate. Unofficially, his orders were clear: watch, listen, and protect. From the moment he arrived, he noticed everything: how Camilla walked the halls like a guest in someone else's dream, how Maria stared out the windows as if still waiting for a voice that would never return, and how the past seemed to echo louder than any footsteps in that house. What no one spoke of, but everyone felt, was that the war hadn't ended at the front lines. For some, it had followed them home. And in that house of memories, where silence weighed more than words, the true battles had only just begun. A few days later, the rain fell steadily over the countryside, turning the gardens of the estate into a sea of mist and mud. Inside, the old mansion felt even colder, the silence interrupted only by the soft patter of water on the windows and the distant creaks of aging floorboards. In the kitchen, where warmth was usually found in the clatter of pots and the scent of bread, tension now simmered. It happened suddenly, a sharp crash followed by stunned silence. A porcelain vase lay shattered across the stone floor, not just any vase, but a rare piece gifted by the French resistance. An object that carried stories of courage, hidden maps, and quiet defiance. Alfred had cherished it as a symbol of sacrifice. Its loss was not merely decorative, it was personal. Maria appeared moments later, her hands crossed and face pale, with a carefully rehearsed look of surprise. She glanced down at the broken shards, then turned toward Alfred with the ease of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "I found it like this," she said softly. "But Camilla was here just minutes ago. I assumed she might have been careless." Her tone dripped with false concern, her words measured. It wasn't the vase that shattered, it was trust, carefully chipped away with a single accusation. Camilla stood frozen in the doorway, caught between shock and outrage. Her hands trembled, not from guilt, but from the sheer injustice of it. Still, she spoke with control, her voice calm though her eyes burned. "If you have no proof," she said, meeting Maria's gaze without flinching, "then you have no right to speak." Alfred hesitated. He looked from one woman to the other, troubled. His instincts told him Camilla wouldn't lie, but the weight of war had blurred his confidence. Doubt seeped in like the rain through the old walls. It was then that Churchill stepped into the room. He hadn't planned to overhear the conversation. He had arrived to discuss evacuation routes with Alfred, urgent matters of logistics and survival, but the tone of the voices had drawn him in. He stood just beyond the threshold, one hand resting on his cane, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "A blindfold may cover the eyes of justice," Churchill said quietly, stepping forward, "but let us not pretend we cannot see what's in plain sight." The room fell silent. Even Maria lowered her gaze. "There are many ways to fight a war," he continued, his tone low and deliberate. "Some battles are fought with weapons, others with whispers." With that, he turned to Alfred and offered a subtle nod, as if to say, "Be careful who you trust." Then, without another word, he returned to the study, leaving behind a room heavier than before. From that moment on, the air in the mansion changed. Camilla, though still isolated, knew she had an unseen ally. And Maria, for all her bitterness, now understood something else. Not everyone could be manipulated so easily, especially not Winston Churchill. That night, the mansion groaned beneath the weight of another storm. Wind rattled the old shutters, and rain traced long fingers down the windows, blurring the moonlight. Inside, the corridors remained dim, lit only by flickering lamps and the distant hum of whispered conversations. It was the kind of night when the past felt close, when secrets seemed to drift through the halls like smoke. By morning, everything had changed. A golden necklace, delicate, finely made, and known by all to belong to Maria, was found tucked beneath the pillow in Camilla's room. Its sudden reappearance shocked everyone. For Alfred, already struggling to reconcile conflicting loyalties, the discovery struck like a quiet blow. He said little, but the way he looked at Camilla changed, more guarded, less certain. Camilla tried to explain, but the words came slowly, weighed down by the disbelief in Alfred's eyes. She hadn't touched the necklace. She didn't even know it had gone missing, but innocence means little when trust begins to crack. That morning, Churchill requested a private moment with Sergeant Felipe Darcy. They met in the drawing room, where the fire had long burned out, and the air was damp with unease. Churchill stood by the window, his silhouette framed by grey light. He didn't speak at first. Then, in a low, steady voice, he broke the silence. "There are more battles behind closed doors than on any battlefield," he said, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. "This girl, Camilla, she fights a war of her own, and she does so quietly, with dignity. Watch over her, not just as a soldier, but as a man who knows what it means to lose more than one's footing in the mud." Felipe nodded without hesitation. He had begun to see what Churchill already understood. Camilla's strength wasn't loud or visible, but it held firm. The accusations, the cold glances, the traps. She faced them all without bitterness, carrying something deep within her that no one had yet broken. From that day forward, Felipe made no effort to hide where his loyalties stood. He accompanied Camilla through the mansion's corridors, helped her with small tasks, and answered her questions with a kindness that hadn't been seen in that house for a long time. Others noticed, Maria noticed, but so did Carmen, the Spanish cook with tired eyes and calloused hands. Once married to a Republican fighter who never returned from the mountains, Carmen had no reason to trust the world. But something in Camilla reminded her of the women who stayed behind and bore the weight of quiet revolutions. Without saying much, she began to show small signs of support. A warm meal left aside, a door opened at just the right moment, a warning whispered when Maria came too close. Little by little, alliances began to form, soft ones, invisible to those who weren't paying attention. But in a house filled with echoes, it was enough to plant the first seeds of resistance. Because sometimes survival doesn't come from shouting. It comes from being seen quietly by those who still believe. It was just past midnight when Felipe Darcy, unable to sleep, wandered the outer halls of the estate. The wind howled through the chimney shafts, and the glow of the oil lamps cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The house was unusually quiet, but in wartime, quiet often meant something was wrong. Near the old servants' wing, Felipe paused. Voices, low, urgent, muffled by the thick walls, but unmistakably tense. He followed them, moving silently until he reached a narrow passage near the wine cellar. There, behind a half-open door, he caught sight of Maria Spencer, her hair pulled back, her voice cold, and beside her stood a man he didn't recognize. His presence alone was alarming. His uniform didn't match any Allied division, and his accent betrayed something far more dangerous. Rodrigo. A name Felipe had only heard in whispers. Once a field agent for the Nazi intelligence service, now a ghost, working in the shadows as a mercenary, trading information and sabotage for profit. And here he was, in the heart of Alfred's estate, speaking with Maria as if they'd done this before. Felipe stayed hidden, heart pounding. He couldn't catch every word, but what he heard was enough. The necklace wasn't enough, Rodrigo murmured. We need something that will leave no doubt, something permanent. Maria nodded. She's clever, but I know how to make her look guilty. When she's gone, everything returns to how it should be. Felipe didn't hesitate. With a small, concealed device tucked in his coat, a habit from his days in reconnaissance, he recorded what he could before slipping away. He knew time was short. The noose around Camilla was tightening. By sunrise, Felipe was knocking on Churchill's door. Inside the study, the Prime Minister listened in silence, the faint crackle of the recording device the only sound in the room. When it ended, he said nothing for a moment, staring into the hearth where the embers of the night's fire still glowed faintly. Then, in a voice edged with iron, he spoke. We're fighting the Germans on the battlefield, but we must not turn a blind eye to the poison spreading inside our own homes. Churchill sat down at the desk and began drafting a classified report. The names, the evidence, the threats, it would all be delivered to the Allied command before dusk. This was no longer a domestic affair. It was a matter of security, of integrity, of trust in the very fabric they were trying to preserve through the war. Felipe stood by, awaiting orders, but Churchill merely looked at him and said, "Keep her safe. The shadows are moving quickly now, and we'll need light, not just weapons, to push them back." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the storm inside the estate was only just beginning. Before dawn, while the estate still slept beneath a heavy sky, footsteps crept through the upper halls. Unseen hands worked in silence, and by the time the sun rose pale over Normandy, the final trap had been set. Under Camilla's bed, hidden just beyond sight, someone had placed a locked wooden box filled with stacks of old French francs, currency used by the Allied forces to supply local resistance cells. By mid-morning, Maria stood in the middle of the room, her voice sharp and triumphant. "She was going to run," she said, turning to Alfred with a look of feigned hurt. "Take the money and disappear. Betray everything you've done for her." Camilla, stunned, stood speechless. She had never seen that box before. But in the wake of so many doubts, her voice carried little weight. Alfred, his shoulders hunched and his hands trembling, looked older than ever. His strength, once so unshakable, now flickered like a candle in the wind. He opened his mouth to speak, to cast judgment that would shatter what little remained of their fragile bond. But the door creaked open, and Churchill entered. The room fell into silence. With measured steps, he approached, holding a small recorder in one hand and a folded envelope in the other. Without raising his voice, he turned to the senior officer in charge of the region, who stood behind him, summoned earlier that morning by Churchill's urgent message. "Before we condemn anyone," Churchill said calmly, "let us first listen." He pressed play. Rodrigo's voice filled the room like a cold wind. Maria's, unmistakable and clear, followed. Plotting, accusing, conspiring. Every detail of the deception was laid bare. The officers stood frozen. Alfred's expression crumbled into disbelief. Maria's face drained of color, her composure unraveling in seconds. Churchill stepped forward, placing the recorder gently on a nearby table. "Lies," he said, his voice low but commanding, "are like hidden mines. They lie still until someone steps on them." Then, turning to Alfred, he added with quiet intensity, "And when they explode, it is not just the guilty who suffer, but everyone standing nearby." No one spoke. Even Maria, once proud and sharp-tongued, could find no defense. The officers took her aside. Rodrigo had already disappeared into the mist, but the trail was now active and orders had been issued to track him. Alfred, broken by what had nearly happened under his roof, looked at Camilla. Shame welled in his eyes. For the first time in days, he reached out, not with words, but with a small, trembling gesture, as if asking for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. Camilla said nothing, but the weight of that moment, the unraveling of lies, the quiet return of truth, spoke louder than any reply. Churchill remained still, his gaze sweeping across the room. In war, there are victories no trumpet will ever announce, and this was one of them. Quiet, painful, and deeply human. In the days that followed Maria's downfall, the atmosphere in the mansion remained tense, like a storm that had passed but left the skies uncertain. Trust had been fractured, and for every answer uncovered, more questions emerged. Churchill, ever perceptive, ordered a quiet investigation into everyone who had regular access to the estate. Nothing was to be assumed, not anymore. That's when the name Javier began to resurface. Javier had been Alfred's estate administrator for years, a man who kept the books, managed the staff, and walked the halls with the confidence of someone who belonged. He had a calm voice, impeccable manners, and a reputation for efficiency. But when Felipe began cross-referencing supply logs with Allied movement reports, things stopped adding up. Shipments that never arrived, sums that vanished, and worse, delays that had endangered lives at nearby outposts. Churchill made his decision swiftly. Late that afternoon, accompanied by Felipe and Camilla, he entered Javier's office at the back of the estate. The door was locked. Felipe forced it open with one solid push. Inside, the room was neat, too neat. Churchill, silent but alert, began scanning the shelves. Camilla moved to the desk and found a loose panel beneath the drawer. Behind it, hidden under layers of false paperwork, they discovered what they feared. Forged documents, sealed letters with German insignias, and maps marked with Allied positions, some of them dated mere days before planned operations. Pages stained with betrayal. As Camila reached for one of the folders, a sudden blur of movement came from behind. Javier had entered through a rear corridor and in an instant of desperate rage lunged toward her. His hand was raised, his face twisted with panic. Not the cold calculation of a spy, but the frantic violence of someone cornered. But Felipe was faster. He blocked Javier mid-strike, slamming him against the wall with a force that echoed through the room. The two struggled briefly, but Javier, older and weaker, gave in. Churchill stepped between them, his expression grave but composed. "This war," he said, his voice firm and unwavering, "will not be won by strength alone. It will be won with paper and with courage." He turned to Javier, now restrained and silent, and added, "You used both in the wrong hands. Others will use them for justice." By nightfall, the documents were sealed and handed to Allied intelligence. Orders were given to secure every name mentioned. The mansion, once a home, then a battleground of shadows, was slowly being cleared of the rot festering behind its walls. As for Camila, she stood tall that evening, not because she had been spared, but because she had refused to break. Churchill noticed it too, the resilience in her eyes, quiet, unshaken, and for the first time in weeks, something returned to the halls of that old estate. Dignity. After the arrest of Javier and the capture of Rodrigo, a strange stillness settled over the mansion, one that felt neither like peace nor victory, but something in between. The corridors were quieter now, the whisper of betrayal no longer hanging in the air. And yet, one final conversation still waited to be had. Churchill called for Maria. She entered the study hesitantly, her steps slower than usual, her shoulders no longer held high with pride. This was not the woman who once spoke with poison behind smiles. This was someone unraveling, someone exhausted from fighting battles that no longer made sense. Churchill stood by the fireplace, the orange glow casting lines across his face. He said nothing at first, letting the silence speak. Then finally, his voice broke through. "You've waged a war no soldier could win, Maria." At those words, she lowered her gaze. Her lips trembled, and for the first time since her arrival, the walls around her heart collapsed. "I lost my father," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "I lost my husband, and now I've lost myself." Tears streamed down her face, honest, unrestrained, and long overdue. She didn't ask for pity. She didn't beg for absolution. But in that moment, she was no longer an enemy. She was simply human. Behind Churchill, the door opened. It was Camila. She had heard what was said, and though her soul still carried bruises, she stepped forward without bitterness. "The war takes so much from us," she said gently, looking at Maria, not with scorn but with quiet understanding. "But it can't take away our chance to begin again, unless we let it." For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Maria nodded, grateful, ashamed, and humbled all at once. Later that day, Alfred called Camila to the study. His hands, once strong and certain, now trembled slightly as he reached for her. His eyes were misted with something deeper than sorrow. Remorse. "I failed you," he said softly. "I let doubt blind me, and for that, I ask your forgiveness." Camila said nothing. She simply placed her hand on his, just enough for him to know he had it. Alfred smiled, just faintly, and took a document from his desk. It bore the seal of the Allied Humanitarian Council. He held it out, to her. "This estate has always been a place of order. Now, I want it to be a place of healing. I'm naming you head of all relief operations here. Refugees, orphans, displaced families. It's your mission now, if you'll accept it." Camila took the document in both hands. Her heart once filled with fear, now carried something else: purpose. In the days that followed, the mansion slowly transformed. Rooms once filled with suspicion opened to shelter those in need. The scent of warm meals returned to the kitchen, and in the garden, where broken statues once stood, children began to play again. It was not the end of the war, but it was a beginning. Weeks had passed since the walls of the old estate echoed with tension. Now, under a sky softened by early spring, the courtyard was filled with laughter, gentle, uncertain at first, but growing stronger with each passing hour. Children ran between the columns, their clothes worn but clean. Women gathered blankets and volunteers carried baskets of bread and fruit. It was the day of the peace event, organized not by generals or governments, but by a young woman who had once arrived there as a stranger. Camilla stood at the center of it all, guiding the day with quiet grace. What had once been a house divided was now a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to go. Her voice, once hesitant, now held weight. Her smile, though marked by everything she had endured, shone with the kind of strength that only comes from surviving with dignity. Winston Churchill was present, his coat neatly pressed, his expression softer than usual. When he stood to speak, the crowd grew still. "There are many kinds of heroism," he said, pausing to let the moment breathe. "Some carry rifles, others carry something far heavier: hope." His words fell into the silence like warm light into cold stone. For a man who had walked through so much, this moment felt different. Less about politics, more about people. Less about victory, more about healing. Later, as the sun began to set, Maria approached Camilla once more. She was no longer the woman who had plotted in the shadows. Her eyes were red from emotion, her steps hesitant. "I hope," she whispered, "that one day you might see me as family." Camilla looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her. No conditions, no revenge, only peace. "The truest kind of family," she said softly, "is born in the moments we choose to love." And with those words, her journey quietly came full circle. Churchill watched from a distance, his gaze fixed not on the scene before him, but on something deeper, something within. For a man who had delivered orders across continents, who had written speeches that shaped the world, this story had left its mark on him not through politics, but through people. That night, he returned to his quarters, lit a lamp, and opened his journal. In his familiar handwriting, he wrote only one sentence. The war did not end in silence, but in forgiveness. He closed the book and stared out the window. The garden below was dark now, but the voices of children still floated in the air like a lullaby to a tired world. And in that moment, he felt something rare, a peace not from treaties or surrenders, but from a single choice made in the heart of a young woman who had refused to give up on love, on truth, and on the future. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in her place? What other stories of soldiers and survivors should be told? If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one, stories of courage, humanity, and the quiet triumphs that shaped history. Until the next story, stay brave, stay kind, and never forget.